Vienna. The autumn of 1908. A young man of 19 climbs a marble staircase to read a list pinned to a wall. It is the admissions list of the Academy of Fine Arts. His name is not on it. For the second year running, the Academy has rejected him. In the world we know, that rejected young painter is Adolf Hitler, and the failure of that single ambition sets him eventually on the road to becoming the most destructive figure of the 20th century. But what if his name had been on the list? What if the Vienna Academy had simply said yes? What would the 20th century have looked like without Adolf Hitler? To understand this alternate history, you have to first understand that the most consequential life of the 20th century very nearly never happened at all. Adolf Hitler in 1908 was nobody. He was a 19-year-old from a small Austrian town, recently orphaned of his father, with no qualifications, no career, and one consuming ambition. He wanted to be an artist. He went to Vienna, the great imperial capital, the center of the art world he dreamed of, and he applied to the Academy of Fine Arts. He was rejected. His drawings, the Academy noted, showed some facility with buildings and architecture, but he was judged weak at drawing the human figure, and the human figure was the heart of the classical training the Academy offered. He applied again the following year. This time, he was not even permitted to sit the full examination, and then his life simply came apart. The young Hitler spent the next years in Vienna, sliding into poverty. He ran out of money. He stayed for a time in a home for the destitute, a men's hostel for the poor and the homeless. He survived by painting small, competent, unremarkable postcards and pictures of Vienna's landmarks, and selling them for a few coins. These were, by every account, his lost years. Aimless, bitter, resentful, and it was in these years, many historians believe, in the poverty and the failure and the grievance of pre-war Vienna, that the young man absorbed the poisonous ideas, the extreme nationalism, the conspiratorial anti-Semitism that would later define him. But here is the crucial point. Even after all of that, even after the rejection and the poverty and the hostel, the man was still nobody. In 1913, he was an obscure, failed artist, drifting between cities. There was nothing. Yet, that marked him out for history. What transformed him was not the art rejection alone. It was everything that came after, and above all, one enormous event that we have explored on this channel before: the First World War. So the question is not simply whether art school would have changed one man's mood. The question is what the 20th century becomes if the specific chain, rejection, poverty, grievance, and then the war, is broken at its very first link. In the real world, the Vienna Academy rejected Adolf Hitler. In our alternate timeline, it accepts him. We do not need a fantasy. We do not need to reinvent the man. We need one small change inside one admissions committee in the autumn of 1908. The decision in our timeline was close enough to be ordinary. The committee saw a young applicant with a real, if limited, talent, genuinely capable with architecture and buildings, weaker with the human figure. Admissions committees make judgment calls. They weigh promise against weakness. A slightly different panel, a slightly more generous mood. A professor who happened to be taken with the boy's architectural drawings, and the decision tips the other way. So, in this timeline, in the autumn of 1908, Adolf Hitler climbs the marble staircase, reads the list, and finds his own name. He is admitted to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. Now, what happens to him? We must be honest, and we must resist. The sentimental version of this story, acceptance into art school, does not magically make this young man a good person. It does not reach into his soul and remove his prejudices, the anti-Semitism, the resentment, the grandiosity. The seeds of those things were in the young Hitler before 1908 and were widespread in the culture around him. Art school does not perform an exorcism, but here is what art school does do. It changes the trajectory in our timeline. The rejection sent the young Hitler sliding downward into poverty, into the hostel, into bitter, aimless years with nothing to do but stew. In the alternate timeline, the acceptance gives him something our timeline never did. A place, a structure, a path, however modest, toward an ordinary life. He studies. He is, by the evidence of his real surviving work, a mediocre, fine artist, but a competent draftsman with that genuine eye for buildings. In this timeline, he most likely does not become a great painter. He becomes something far more ordinary. Perhaps an architectural draftsman, an illustrator, a minor commercial artist in some Austrian or German city, an unremarkable man. A small, private, forgettable life. That is the divergence. Not redemption, not a hero. Just one obscure young man who, in our timeline, was pushed down a road toward grievance and catastrophe, and who, in this one, is simply allowed to remain obscure. To understand what this timeline changes, you have to follow the ordinary man, and then you have to follow the great event that, in our timeline, found him in the alternate timeline. The years pass. The art student becomes a working artist of modest success. He is, perhaps, still a difficult man, still opinionated, still carrying ugly views, common in his time and place, but he carries them the way millions of ordinary people carry ugly views, privately, ineffectually, without power, without consequence. He is a man in a coffee house, complaining. Not a man on a balcony, commanding. And then comes 1914. The First World War still breaks out in this timeline. Because, as we explored in a previous episode, the war had many deep causes. And the rejection or acceptance of one art student does nothing to stop it. The alternate Hitler, like millions of other young men of Austria and Germany, very likely serves in that war. In our timeline, he served for 4 years, was decorated for bravery, was wounded, and was temporarily blinded by gas near the war's end. In the alternate timeline, one of several things might happen to him. He might be killed. The First World War killed an enormous proportion of the young men who fought it, and the man we are following would have no special protection. He might simply be one name among the millions of the lost, or he might survive as an ordinary veteran. He might come home to his modest career, shaken, perhaps embittered, like so many veterans of that terrible war. But he comes home as a private man, a former soldier returning to a drawing board, not a future Führer returning to a political mission. Because here is the deepest point of this entire episode. The thing that made Adolf Hitler into Adolf Hitler was not primarily the art rejection. It was what happened in the specific narrow window after the First World War, when a defeated, humiliated, economically shattered Germany proved to be the perfect poisoned ground for a particular kind of demagogue to grow. In our timeline, the failed artist walked into that window at exactly the right moment, with exactly the grievances, the moment rewarded, and exactly the gift for speaking to angry, frightened crowds. In the alternate timeline, the man who walks out of the war is not primed for that window. He has a career. He has a life. He has, for 15 years, been an ordinary working artist, not a drifting, failed, resentful nobody, with nothing to lose, and one terrible talent for hatred. Here is the difficult part of this episode. The hardest and the most important. It is tempting to imagine that removing Hitler simply removes the catastrophe that the alternate 20th century is our century with the horror quietly deleted. We have to resist that. An honest alternate history demands that we ask a harder question. In the alternate timeline, the failed artist never becomes a dictator, but the conditions that produced his rise still exist. Think carefully about what those conditions were. After the First World War, Germany was defeated, humiliated, and burdened by a harsh peace treaty. Its economy was shattered, first by a catastrophic hyperinflation in the early 1920 seconds. Then, after a brief recovery, by the Great Depression. At the decade's end, millions were unemployed. Millions were angry, frightened, and humiliated. A widespread, poisonous anti-Semitism already ran through the culture. Bitter myths that the army had been betrayed, stabbed in the back by enemies at home, were already circulating, and a fierce, resentful nationalism was already looking for a voice. None of that was created by one man. All of it existed independently of Adolf Hitler. So we have to face the grim possibility in the alternate timeline with the failed artist safely painting buildings. Some other figure may rise to ride that same wave of grievance and fear. In the chaos of 1920 seconds and 1930 seconds, Germany, there were many radical nationalist movements, many bitter demagogues, many men hungry for power and willing to exploit the nation's pain. One of them, in this timeline, may step into the empty space. But, and this is the essential point, that other figure is not Hitler, and that difference may matter enormously. Historians who study this often make a careful argument. The conditions for the rise of an authoritarian nationalist regime in Germany were strong. Some kind of dark turn was disturbingly likely, but Adolf Hitler, specifically, his particular fanaticism, his particular obsessions, his specific and absolute commitment to a war of conquest and to the total extermination of European Jews, that specific and uniquely catastrophic program was not inevitable. Another nationalist leader might have built an ugly, repressive, authoritarian Germany. That alone would be a tragedy. But another leader might not have launched a war designed to conquer an entire continent. Another leader might not have conceived and ordered and driven forward the specific industrialized genocide of the Holocaust. So, the alternate timeline does not promise us a gentle, peaceful Germany. What it offers is something more limited and more honest. The removal of one specific man whose specific choices turned a likely tragedy into the worst catastrophe in human history. So let us follow that thread forward. If some other nationalist leader rises in 1930 seconds, Germany, does the Second World War still happen? This is where we must be most careful and most honest. The answer is not a clean yes or a clean no. It is a range of possibilities, and an honest alternate history has to lay them out. At one end is the darker possibility. A different authoritarian Germany still arises. It still rearms. It still seeks to overturn the hated peace settlement and to dominate its neighbors. And so a major European war still breaks out in the late 1930 seconds, or the 1940 seconds. But even in that darker case, the war is different. The Second World War of our timeline was shaped in its specific course by Hitler's specific decisions. His timing, his obsessions, his catastrophic strategic gambles, his decision to invade the Soviet Union, his insistence on fighting to the absolute, total destruction of Germany itself, rather than ever seeking terms. A different leader fights a different war, perhaps a more limited one, perhaps one that ends in a negotiated peace rather than total annihilation, perhaps one that never widens into a true world war at all. At the other end of the range is the more hopeful possibility, without Hitler's specific, relentless drive toward war, without a leader absolutely committed to conquest as his life's purpose. The crises of the 1930 seconds might be contained. An authoritarian Germany might still be a grim, repressive place for its own people, but it might stop short of plunging the world into a second catastrophe. We genuinely cannot know which of these the alternate timeline produces. What we can say is that the specific Second World War of our history, the one that killed an estimated 70 to 85 million people, that exact war is not inevitable. And there is one consequence that is far less uncertain. One thing that we can speak about with much greater confidence. The Holocaust was not a general consequence of the Second World War. It was not something that simply happened because there was a war. The Holocaust was the specific, deliberate, ideologically driven project of the Nazi regime and of Adolf Hitler himself. The planned, industrialized murder of 6 million Jewish people and of millions of others. The regime deemed unworthy of life. That catastrophe was not an accident of war. It was a purpose. It required a regime organized around that exact hatred, led by a man for whom that extermination was a central and non-negotiable goal. So, even in the darkest version of the alternate timeline, even one with a different authoritarian Germany, even one with a major war, the specific, deliberate genocide of the Holocaust is the single thing most likely to be different, most likely to be smaller, most likely in its specific, planned industrial totality, never to happen at all. Some of the deepest consequences of removing Hitler are about the shape of the entire world that the Second World War created, because our world, the world you are living in right now, was very largely forged in that war and its aftermath. Consider the most basic facts of the later 20th century. The Second World War ended with two superpowers, dominant the United States and the Soviet Union. It was the war that pulled the United States permanently into the center of world affairs. It was the war that left the Soviet Union in control of half of Europe. The Cold War, the division of the continent, the long nuclear standoff, all of it flowed directly from how that war ended. The war drove the crash program that produced nuclear weapons. It shattered the old European colonial empires, accelerating the wave of decolonization that remade Asia and Africa. It led directly to the founding of the United Nations. It reshaped borders across the entire globe. So in the alternate timeline, where the specific Second World War does not happen or happens. In some smaller, more limited form, almost none of that follows. In the same way, the 20th century takes a fundamentally different shape. Without the war we know, the United States may not rise so far or so fast into global leadership. The Soviet Union may not come to dominate Eastern Europe because, in our timeline, it did so by defeating the German armies and occupying the territory they had held. No such war, no such occupation, no such Iron Curtain falling across the heart of Europe. The Cold War of our history, that specific decades-long world-defining standoff, may simply not occur, or it may take some other form between some other powers on some other timeline. And we should be honest that this is not purely a story of relief. The Second World War, for all its horror, also broke things that needed breaking. It discredited, utterly and permanently, the ideologies of fascism and Nazism. It accelerated the end of colonialism. It produced, in its aftermath, a powerful global consensus expressed in the founding of the United Nations and in the idea of universal human rights, that such a catastrophe must never be allowed to happen again in the alternate timeline. Those hard-won lessons are never taught because the catastrophe that taught them never comes. The old empires may linger longer. The dangerous ideologies may not be so thoroughly discredited. The alternate world avoids our century's greatest wound, but it also never receives the grim education that the wound left behind. Now, we have to widen the lens, because the Second World War did not only redraw borders, it transformed science and technology and the everyday texture of modern life, and not always in ways we like to admit. War, terribly, is an accelerant. A total war pours enormous resources into urgent technical problems and many technologies that shape our world were driven forward dramatically by the Second World War. The most obvious is the one we have already named: nuclear weapons. And, flowing from the same physics, nuclear power were the product of a colossal wartime program funded on a scale that only the desperation of total war could justify, but it goes far beyond the bomb. The war dramatically accelerated the development of the jet engine, which would transform civilian air travel. It drove the early development of electronic computing, machines built to break codes and calculate firing tables. It pushed forward radar, rocketry, and the mass production of antibiotics like penicillin, which would go on to save countless millions of lives. So picture the alternate timeline. If the specific, all-consuming Second World War does not happen, then that specific violent acceleration does not happen either. This does not mean the alternate world is technologically backward. The underlying science still advances. Nuclear physics is still understood. Computing, jet propulsion, antibiotics, all of these still arrive because the scientific ideas behind them were already in motion, but they arrive differently, most likely slower, in some cases developed at the gentler pace of peacetime research and commercial demand, rather than the frantic, bottomless funding of total war. And that cuts in more than one direction. A world that develops nuclear weapons more slowly in peacetime without the searing example of Hiroshima and Nagasaki may be a world that handles those weapons with less caution because it has never seen directly what they do. Or it may be a world that simply has fewer of them later, and so buys itself more time to grow wiser before it must confront them. And the medical thread is the most poignant of all. The mass production of penicillin was hugely accelerated by the war's demand to save wounded soldiers. In the alternate timeline, antibiotics still come, but perhaps a few years later, reaching the public on a different schedule. And a few years in the history of a life saving medicine is measured in human lives. It is an uncomfortable truth. The catastrophe of the Second World War killed tens of millions, and also, through its brutal acceleration of technology, reshaped, and in some cases, lengthened billions of other lives. The alternate timeline escapes the killing, but it also gives up the terrible, unwanted gifts that the killing left behind. There is one consequence of this timeline. That is the hardest to measure because it is not about technology or borders or even the dead. It is about the moral memory of the human species. The Second World War and the Holocaust did not only kill, they taught. They left behind a permanent mark on the modern conscience, a set of lessons so deep that we now treat them as simple, obvious truth. The Holocaust is, in our world, the ultimate reference point for evil when we want to name the worst that human beings can do, the worst that prejudice and propaganda and the unchecked power of the state can produce. We point to the Holocaust. It is the warning carved into the foundation of the modern world. From that catastrophe came an enormous body of moral and legal response. The very word genocide was coined. In response to it, the Nuremberg trials established the principle that there are crimes against humanity itself, crimes for which leaders can be held to account. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the phrase repeated for generations, never again. All of that is the hard-won inheritance of the worst event in human history. Now, think about the alternate timeline. In the alternate timeline, the specific catastrophe of the Holocaust does not happen, or does not happen, in that total industrialized continent spanning form. And that means the lesson is never taught. This is a genuinely difficult thought. The alternate world is spared the unspeakable suffering of 6 million murdered people and millions of others. That sparing is an immeasurable good. No one could wish that suffering back into existence. But the alternate world also never receives the terrible education it does not have. The Holocaust as its absolute warning. It may not develop in the same way the modern machinery of human rights, the concept of crimes against humanity, the deep, reflexive cultural horror of anti-Semitism and of state-organized hatred. And here is the unsettling possibility. The hatreds that produced the Holocaust did not vanish from the world because of the war. They were discredited, driven to the margins, precisely because the world saw in full and undeniable horror where they led. In the alternate timeline, that prejudice is never so completely discredited. It may remain more respectable, more mainstream, more able to do quiet, ongoing harm, precisely because it was never dragged into the light and shown beyond all argument for what it is. It is the bleakest of ironies. The alternate world avoids the single greatest crime of our history, but in avoiding it, it may also avoid the hard permanent lesson, and a civilization that never learns how monstrous hatred can become, may simply be more vulnerable to letting it grow. Let us follow the alternate timeline all the way down, past the 1,940 seconds, past the war that may or may not come, into the deep modern consequences. Start with the most uncomfortable one. This timeline is not a paradise. It is tempting to imagine that a 20th century without Hitler is simply a century of peace and decency. But we have spent this episode resisting exactly that comfort. The alternate 20th century still has the First World War with all its millions of dead. It still, very possibly, has an authoritarian Germany of some kind. It may still have a major war. In the 1,930 seconds, or 1,940 seconds, it still has the ordinary supply of tyrants and conflicts and cruelties that every century produces. Removing one man does not remove human darkness. It removes one specific, uniquely catastrophic expression of it. Now, turn to something quieter and almost unbearably poignant. The Second World War and the Holocaust killed something on the order of 70 to 85 million people, soldiers and civilians, whole communities, whole worlds of human life extinguished. Somewhere inside that staggering number were the people the world never got to have, the scientists whose discoveries were never made, the writers whose books were never written, the artists, the teachers, the doctors, the parents, the children, the entire cultural universe of European Jewry, its scholars, its traditions, its families, its future, devastated beyond recovery. In the alternate timeline, an immeasurable number of those people simply live. They grow up, they grow old, they marry and work and create and raise their children. The generation that our timeline lost in the camps, on the battlefields, under the bombs, in the alternate timeline is not lost. It is simply there, adding whatever it was, always going to add to the human story. We cannot know what they would have built. That is the deepest wound of all. Not only the lives lost, but the unknowable sum of everything those lives would have made. And yet, this is the honest and uncomfortable heart of the whole episode. We still cannot simply call the alternate timeline the better world. It is, in the matter of the Holocaust, almost certainly a less monstrous world. But it is also a world that never learned our century's hardest lessons. A world without Nuremberg, without never again, without the searing moral clarity that our catastrophe at unspeakable cost burned into us. It is a world that is spared the wound and therefore never carries the scar, and a civilization without that scar may not know, as we know, exactly what it must never become. Some changes ripple farther than wars and borders. They reach into how we understand history itself and the part that single human beings play in it. The life of Adolf Hitler sits at the center of one of the oldest and deepest questions that historians ask. Does history turn on vast, impersonal forces, on economics, on geography, on the slow movements of whole societies? Or does it turn on individuals, on the specific choices of specific people at specific moments? This episode has tried to honor both halves of that question. The impersonal forces were real. The conditions that produced the rise of Nazism The defeat, the humiliation, the economic collapse, the pre-existing hatreds, those were vast, structural, and largely independent of any one man. An honest history cannot pretend that removing Hitler removes all of that. But the individual mattered too. The specific shape of the catastrophe, the specific decision to wage a war of continental conquest, the specific decision to plan and to execute the industrialized murder of millions. Those were not simply the inevitable output of impersonal forces. They bore the fingerprints of one man. And so this episode arrives at a sobering place. A single rejection letter from a single art academy in the autumn of 1908 is one of the smallest imaginable events. An admissions committee glanced at a portfolio of architectural drawings, noted a weakness with the human figure, and said no. And from that small no, through poverty and grievance and a world war and a shattered nation, ran a road that ended in the death of tens of millions of human beings. We tend to imagine that history is the story of the great and the named, of generals and presidents and the famous dead. But this episode is a reminder that history also turns on admissions committees, on clerks, on the small, forgettable decisions of forgettable people. Decisions that, now and then, without anyone knowing it, tip the entire world. Both of these worlds are real possibilities. The world we have, which received the catastrophe and the unbearable lesson and the hard scar of never again, and the world we have imagined, which was spared the worst crime of the century, and which, therefore, never had to learn how monstrous our species can be. And both of them turn, in the end, on a young man climbing a marble staircase in Vienna in the autumn of 1908, and on whether his name that morning was, or was not, on the list. If you want to know what other hinges of history almost swung the other way, subscribe. There are a lot of small decisions, and a lot of ordinary people making them, at moments when the whole world almost went a different way.